Production support for InFocus is provided by Smithville, a locally owned business serving central and southern Indiana since 1922 with residential and business internet, voice, and security services. Smithville, local pride, global technology. Information at smithville.net. Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for central and southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
When Monroe County election results were slowed to a crawl last week due to hand counting of ballots, many pointed to a long-standing dispute over vote centers as the reason. A vote center model would shrink the number of locations at which voters can cast ballots, but would allow votes to be cast at any location in advance of Election Day. But concerns have been raised about how rural counties would adopt vote centers, whether the model would actually save counties money, and how centralized polling locations would affect those who don't have reliable transportation. We'll address these issues and more as we put vote centers in focus. And thanks for joining us for this edition of In Focus. I'm Stan Jastrzebski. If you have questions for one of our studio experts during tonight's program, please email those to us at infocus@indiana.edu. You can also go to indianapublicmedia.org/infocus to see portions of this and other programs. A report from the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute concludes that vote centers would provide a significant savings for all of Indiana's 92 counties. But would it alleviate the problems which stalled Monroe County's vote this year? With those concerns in mind, we welcome in our guests for the evening. They are David Bontorf, the Executive Director of the Association of Indiana Counties, Morgan County Clerk Peggy Mayfield, and Columbus State Representative Milo Smith. Thanks to all three of you for being here this evening. Representative Smith, I want to start with you, go to a conversation that you and I had late last week. You told me that in Bartholomew County, where you live, there were concerns that going to a vote center model might not actually save the county money, and that's one of the reasons that there's been some hesitation. Can you explain to me the conversations you've had with Tammy Hines, the clerk, and with other people about that?
Yes, of course. And again, this is a different model all over the state, and you have different people assessing what needs to be done. And our county clerk with the IT people said it was going to cost money to implement it, and she was concerned, and I think it's an option, that mailing the postcards before every election was going to be a huge expense. But I've since learned that that's not a mandate. You don't have to do that. So that might, I'll take that back to Tammy, and that may help her decide to go with the vote centers for the next election.
David, I actually got those numbers from the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute from a staffer in your office, and I was interested to note, I mean, I looked at literally all of Indiana's 92 counties, and it seemed like everybody would save at least 15 or 20%. Some counties would save 50% or more, regardless of high turnout or low turnout, according to these numbers. How do you explain that that is the case, that there can be this possible across-the-board savings?
Well, their savings really comes from the number of volunteers, or they're not volunteers, the number of paid people you have working the election, because these centers allow you to have fewer poll workers because people can vote any place in the county. And so one of the savings is going to come from, you don't have to have as many poll workers because you don't have as many polling sites. So you're saving on lease space, and then you're not paying as many workers the $100 a day to volunteer. So we think we want it to be a local option, but we think almost every county would experience some savings. And the great thing about the centers as well is that the voters really like them. And Tippecanoe County has been doing it for a number of years. Over 80% of the people who vote say they like the vote centers over the old system. So it saves money, provides better convenience to voters.
That said, you must be getting some pushback from some counties. You must be hearing from county officials who say, we're not sure about these numbers, we're not sure about this model. I would assume there are people who call you on an election cycle basis and go, we don't really know about this.
Yeah. And remember, this is really new. It just became an option for all counties this year. The General Assembly acted quickly on it because it was a high priority for our association, the Clerks Association for taxpayers. Governor Daniels, it was the first bill he signed. It was Senate Enrolled Act 1, started off as, or Public Law 1 started off as Senate Bill 32. And so it's still a new concept, even though it's been out there in 3 pilot counties since 2006. People still have to get used to it. And because it just passed this year, You had municipal elections this year. The clerks needed time to get ready for it. And so I do think there's going to be a need for everybody to get comfortable with it, not only the clerks, but the political parties, the candidates. Each local community has to get comfortable that this is going to save money and provide voter convenience. And again, it may not work for every community, and we certainly don't want to mandate it, but we wanted every county to have the option.
Peggy, tell me about that process in your county. Are people warming to the idea? You're not currently a vote center county, but I'm curious what you're hearing from people about the possibility of, for instance, having them for next year's presidential election, or 3 years from now for having for state races. What are you hearing from people there?
Well, in Morgan County, you're correct. We're not a vote center county, but in late 2007, we did make changes that consolidated our precincts. It did reduce the number of poll workers that were required. It did save quite a bit of money, but it was not allowed to be used on election day, at the addition of satellites and in consolidated polling places. We realized a significant savings and think that if we were to really look at the whole vote center concept, there's a lot more potential and very little change to our voters and our poll workers, because we've taken interim steps to get there. To come in to a county that has never done any of that, they don't have consolidated polling places, or they've never had satellite voting before, that is a huge change for them to adopt in one great big bite.
You find that people you talk to are afraid primarily of the idea of the change, or are there other factors like the money? You said you realized some savings. Do people think that they're not going to save as much money as they thought they might, or are they just afraid of, well, we've got a system that works and we don't necessarily want to walk away from that?
Well, there's certain things you do have to invest in to become a vote center county, and one of those is an electronic poll book. I'm not sure how many counties have gone with that yet. I mean, it's an option now, but you have to have it for a vote center county. That way, when a voter checks in at one location somewhere in the county, it's an immediate lockout so that they cannot go to another location. Their vote's already registered. That's an investment. But from what I'm hearing, even from a county that went with it for the first time in this municipal cycle, Vanderburgh County did it down in Evansville, it looks like they will realize a return on investment after the very next election. So 2 election cycles starts adding up to the savings.
I'd like an answer from each of you kind of on this next question. We'll start with Representative Smith and come back down the line. I wanted to know about a thought that I'd heard from the Hendricks County clerk when I spoke to her a week or so ago. She said she wasn't sure about vote centers. She thought there was support for them in the county, but she also wanted to, and you alluded to this earlier, Representative Smith, she wanted to craft their own solution to this, where the urban areas of the county might use vote centers. But she said, look, there are people in the rural spots in our county who would probably have to drive into a city, and maybe that's not easy for some of them because of transportation issues, because of terrain, because of sheer distance. She wanted to know if it was a possibility, and we'll start with the legislative angle, that some of the county might use vote centers and the rest might stay with the existing precinct model. Does that sound like something that would fly through the General Assembly?
I think it might, because it's tough to have one system that fits all 92 counties, and I don't believe the current system allows you to have a hybrid like that, but I believe we could listen to that, and with the vote centers, they could have more of the polling places out in the rural areas. So they could do that themselves. The county election board could do that.
Obviously, the terrain in Hendricks County is very similar to that, and the setup is very similar to that in Morgan County. Is that something you might consider?
That's something that each election board has to consider, is how many, one is you're required a minimum number of vote centers based on your voter registration population. The next thing you have to consider is where can you place them logistically so that people can get to them, so that they can accommodate a potentially larger number of voters. And so you're not restricted to that minimum, and it would be wise in most cases to go beyond that minimum. And it's all part of the plan that you have to write. You could easily do, and I think that what Hendricks County wants to do, is concentrate vote centers like in the larger cities like Plainfield and Brownsburg and Avon, and still have locations out in the rural areas. They would still be vote centers, but they would be more numerous and probably staffed at lower levels because they would get fewer voters.
David, Representative Smith was talking about the idea of trying to get this to a solution that would accommodate all 92 counties, which is a group of people your organization represents. How might you couch this to people who call you from the various counties and want a solution but don't necessarily want the solutions that are on the table?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of flexibility in the law right now, and one of the things that the counties who have done these for a couple of years, the first thing they did was bring in all the elected officials and the political parties and get everybody's consent that this is the direction we're going to go. We see no advantage for one political party over another. We're in this to save money. We all have to kind of modernize local government, and this is a way to modernize a very basic function of local government. So we'd want to have as much flexibility as possible. None of the counties who have the 3 pilot counties ever had any consideration of switching back. There was no way they wanted to switch back. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in the law now, and if we need to adjust it to allow for more, I don't think there'd be any resistance at the General Assembly.
Let me start with you and go back the other way on this next question. Something that both you and Peggy touched on is the idea of the politics behind all of this. Here in Monroe County, one of the things that has held up vote centers is the concern that you could gerrymander, if you will, the map where you put the vote centers such that they might favor one party over another. And that is one of the big concerns that has slowed the process here. How real a concern is that? I mean, I think people see that perhaps happens when congressional boundaries are drawn every 10 years in the legislature based on the party that's in power, and they think that maybe since you've got places like Monroe County where you typically have one party in power, Bartholomew County, the opposite party is in power on a consistent basis, how big a worry is that sort of gerrymandering, for lack of a better term?
Well, it does take a unanimous vote of the election board or board of registration to do this. So if you have 2 people of one party and the minority party doesn't want to do it, they can block it. So that's why everybody has to agree that we're doing this not for politics, but to save taxpayers money and to make voting more convenient for everybody. So hopefully, again, with any election bill, we always kind of step back and look at the politics of it to see if somebody's going to try to say that it's an advantage of one party or another. But in Wayne County, the county for the most part is Republican-dominated county officials. The mayor's a Democrat. She's very much for the vote centers, so we haven't really seen that resistance. Once everybody comes together, you get the plan put together and take it forward to the public, we think that the R versus D issue can be overcome.
Have you talked politics in Morgan County about the vote center placement?
Not about the placement. Part of our concern are the locations and internet access, and how are we going to do, you have to invest in laptops and so forth. So the initial investment and changing the public education way of doing things has been our main concern. At this time, going into a presidential cycle in a few months, we're not going to even consider it during that cycle. And then the following year, there are no elections. So realistically, the first time that we would even consider doing it would be 2014.
And Representative Smith, you and I talked about this on the phone, and you said perhaps one of the things that might be considered is taking away the unanimous vote and perhaps allowing counties, if it's the will of the people or the will of the legislature, to have just the majority votes such that issues like this on election boards get pushed through where previously they might not have.
I have some concerns about that. I believe you asked me if I would support a mandate for vote centers in all counties, and I said no, but I would listen to a debate about the majority deciding that. But I have some concerns that were mentioned here tonight that I really didn't think about, or some thoughts, and we probably ought to leave that as a unanimous vote because of the politics that play into it, and then everyone feels like they're a member of the team. One last closing comment I have about that. I have some real concerns that we might have to tweak the existing law even further because only 1 out of 89 counties adopted the vote centers after we passed the law.
Why do you suppose that is?
I
Why
don't
do you
know.
suppose there was a reticence?
I think there was a lot of discussion here tonight, and David, you could talk about what your...
I think because, it just passed in the spring of this year, and you had the municipal elections coming upon the clerks, and they have a lot to do this year with redistricting of the General Assembly, having to re-precinct every precinct in the state, and then to actually prepare for the election. So, I hope people don't think that the clerks and our association is not appreciative of the fact that this passed. It's just going to take a little while for everybody to get used to it and find the time to put a plan together to move forward. So, I think that's why only 1 county picked it up so far, And there may be some others next year, but again, the presidential election, from talking to the clerks, I know it really creates a lot of anxiety for them because of the number of people that come out to vote.
It does sound like, from the clerks that I've spoken to, and I've talked to probably 10 of them in the last month or so before the election and afterward, it does sound like that's a big worry, that they don't want to be in a position where a presidential election is anyway in jeopardy, and they want to then have perhaps the year off, so to speak, in 2013 to consider what they're going to do. Is there any necessity to push this forward such that it happens in some places, say for the presidential election, such that the supporters, such as yourself, Representative Smith, would say, look, we understand we can implement this, we understand that it can handle the big pressure that comes with a presidential election, and then you've got a couple of places maybe that are test counties that show that it can work, and all of a sudden everybody else perhaps then jumps on board. Do you need those early adopters to make this a statewide thing?
I don't think so, but I've got concerns that the average poll workers are 72 and 73 years old, so if we add another 3 years on them, they're 75 and 76. And it's just hard to get younger people to work the polls, and I think we have 25,000 poll workers statewide, and if we go to vote centers, that'll decrease that number considerably. Again, it's up to each county election board to determine how many poll workers they're going to need and how many precincts or vote centers they're going to need. But at the same time, the volunteers, or they're not really volunteers, they're getting $100 a day, so they're kind of volunteers, but the poll workers are not getting any younger. And we have to address this because it's very, very difficult to get poll workers to show up on election day and work 14 hours.
We were talking before the show about the issue of having to replace these voting machines every 6 to 8 years, and it's this interesting paradox of where you all were saying that when you had the lever machines, those things lasted decades and decades and decades. Optical scan, you could last 2 or 3 decades, and now here with the e-poll books and all these things, they last 6 to 8 years, you know, at most 3 or 4 election cycles. Peggy, help me with the math on this in terms of going from a standard precinct model to a vote center model. If you're buying these things every 6 to 8 years, do you have to buy fewer of them if you're going to do vote centers? Can you save money in that arena?
Absolutely, yes. Your hardware costs will plummet. We place, in 29 different polling places, we're placing 4 machines. If we adopted vote centers, my guess is we would probably end up with about 8 throughout the county, and maybe 8 to 10 machines in each one.
So it sounds like those machines would be one of the places you would be able to save money relatively immediately within a couple of vote cycles, and we were talking about how Vanderburgh County perhaps has been able to sort of realize those savings initially. What are you hearing, if anything, from vendors of these machines? I was just at a presentation here in Monroe County within the last week from a vendor looking to be the vote center model vendor of machines for Monroe County. Is this something that they are bringing up? Are they in tune with the idea that there is this discussion going on in the state?
They're very aware of it, and they're vying for a lot of the county's attention for when it comes time to replace their machines. Morgan County has about $250,000 of grant money that's wrapped up in our machines, so we're not looking forward to having to replace that anytime soon. We want to try and extend the life of those as much as possible. When it comes time, then again you have a clerk or election board comparing several different vendors to get the best value for the tax dollars that they're spending. So they have to do a lot of analysis. That takes time. You're going to e-poll book vendors and looking at the simplicity of using it. How easy is it to teach a poll worker how to use this software? You have to consider that. These are all time-consuming factors, which is probably why not more counties went with the vote center, because ideally a municipal election is the perfect election to launch a vote center concept, because you have smaller areas of elections going on.
And turnout is much lower.
Right, and turnout is considerably lower, but we tried to get this passed in 2010. No, I'm sorry, the previous year, 2009.
Right.
And the vote center bill did pass, but it was vetoed. So we were hoping that it would pass then so that people would have time to prepare and use it for the 2011 elections. Now that we're going into a highly contested and highly scrutinized presidential, we don't want to insert something new and untried when we're already under a lot of scrutiny.
David, you mentioned that the pilot counties that adopted this by mandate of the Indiana General Assembly, didn't come back and say, we want to go back to the precinct model. But I'm wondering, have you heard anything from those 3 counties where they encountered unforeseen circumstances, perhaps circumstances they were able to work through, but problems or issues that they said, well, this might be an issue for adopting this on a large-scale model?
Well, the internet connection and a secure internet connection was always a big issue. I think making sure that that on election day somebody couldn't tamper with the tally, the poll book. We never saw that happen any place. One of the concerns is training or finding people, again, somebody who's worked the same election cycle or worked elections for years using a certain machine, and now we're bringing in technology. That was a little bit of an issue to get the poll workers comfortable using computers and new technology versus older machines that maybe they felt more comfortable with. But again, and as Peggy mentioned on the machines, one of the reasons I think we'll see everybody start to cycle into this is as the current machines die out, people aren't going to be able to afford to buy as many machines just because of finances. So I think eventually more and more people will come to the vote centers, and some communities may never do it. That, you know, actually maybe some of the rural communities that don't have very many election sites right now, they may just stay with what they have because their cost for elections not that expensive, and they don't want to disrupt the voters. But I think as we move on, and maybe not this next year because of the presidential election, but that off year is the perfect time for the clerk to bring everybody together and get ready for the following year. So
maybe you can help me with this, Peggy. Maybe you can help me with this. Give me a sense of what it costs to have a setup for a vote center model. I know the presentation I went to within the last week, they had a laptop computer that logged people in. They had a little printer that printed out a name and a barcode so that people could affix that to the poll book. They had a machine where you actually did the voting. They had a machine where you inserted your completed ballot. They had a machine for handicapped voters and maybe 1 or 2 other things. What are you, either of you, hearing about the cost for having the actual technology that's necessary to do this? What is going to be the outlay for these setups for counties?
Well, speaking to the Vanderburgh County clerk who just implemented it, their machines, I think she went with the new system, but they were probably going to go with that system anyway. So that's not changing voting systems is not a direct cost of vote centers. That's just a county decision. If we went to it, we would use our existing machines. Our outlay would be on the software and the laptops. So she threw some numbers to me. Her laptops ran about $600 each. She got a little printer to go by each one for around $100 each, and then you have your mouse and maybe an air card depending on your internet connections. She had 9 people at each of her 18 polling locations. So her outlay on her laptops was about $72,000, more or less.
Plus the cost of whatever the machines are that you have to buy from the vendor, I would assume.
But you can use your existing machines.
Well, but at some point you're going to have to buy new machines.
But you would have to buy new machines whether or not you were a vote center county.
Are the cost of those machines, we talked about the longevity of them, but are the cost of those machines going up, down, staying the same over the course of time? I would think that as you have more and more integrated circuits in a machine, it's like the Moore's law of voting machines that you have for computers. Things get faster, but they might also get more expensive, especially as new machines are put out onto the market. Are we seeing that at all?
The last time we bought a machine actually was purchased before I took office, and then I got the bill and paid it. So I happen to know that our units were $3,000, I think right at $3,000 each.
And what does that $3,000 cover per unit?
The panel itself, which is about the size of a laptop, the voting case, about the size of a suitcase, and it's self-contained, it has its legs and its electrical connections and so forth.
One of the things that's been brought up here in Monroe County too is the ability to get voters who may not be as mobile as most voters into polling places if you go to a vote center model. I want to know, first from a legislative standpoint, Representative Smith, if you're writing this and you want to make sure that, for instance, the vote center model is ADA compliant,
Yes.
I would assume this is something that you have people coming to you and going, wait, we have to make sure that the elderly voters, the disabled voters, those people are taken care of first and foremost.
Absolutely, and we won't waver on that. they have to be ADA approved and handicap accessible. And if there are any issues, even if someone comes to us and says, this polling place is not ADA approved, or I have a difficult time getting in, or the doorway's a little tight, they'll bring that up to the clerk and she'll take it to the election board, and it probably won't be held there again.
And I would assume that there's a process that a county goes through to vet all of its voting sites, is that correct?
We do. We have a checklist for ADA compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And what kinds of things are you looking for that maybe you wouldn't think about other than just, you know, width of a doorway, making sure there's a ramp, things like that?
Well, one is the slope of that ramp. I didn't realize, I mean, it can only go up so much per foot, a few inches per foot. And access to a doorway. Well, one of the things that's pointed out is you may have a sidewalk alongside a building, but if that building has a gutter that crosses that sidewalk, it's suddenly impassable to somebody with a walker or a wheelchair. So even though you have a ramp, you can't get to it. So those are all things to be considered. Handlebar doorknobs, or something that can be grabbed. Anyone with arthritis or sensitive hands, you need to consider that. Handicap bathrooms, because those workers or anyone in there may need to use a restroom while they're waiting in line to vote.
One last question for each of you. I'll give you each 20 or 30 seconds. David, we'll start with you. This doesn't seem to me to be a partisan issue. I've talked to both Democrats and Republicans who are in favor of it, and yet it's not happening in Indiana. Why not, and how can we overcome this reticence for a nonpartisan issue?
Again, I think just because it passed this year for the option for all counties, and we advocated for this for a couple years, and I just think it's going to take, again, time for each community needs to kind of develop this plan for themselves. And I think it would be bad if the state mandated it, because then it might look partisan in some manner. So I think each community needs to come together with their local elected leaders, the political leaders, and develop a plan that everybody feels comfortable with.
Peggy, 15, 20 seconds?
One thing that happened as clerks took office in 2011, we have 34 new clerks throughout the state. It's one thing to go to vote centers, it's another thing. You have to grasp the duties of your office first and how you run an election before you change how that happens. Another thing is, Martin County, I believe, only has 6 precincts, whereas Marion County has 500 plus. So you can't write a plan that's going to fit both of those counties. It really does need to be a local plan that's decided on by that election board. All
right, I apologize, but they're telling me we've run out of time, but thank you very much to the three of you for being here. It's an issue we've gone round and round about here in Monroe County, but thanks to the three of you for your expertise this evening. I certainly appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks to all of you who watched and listened as well, and thanks to all of you who watched and listened this year. Please post your questions at infocus@indiana.edu, and we'll see you in 2012. Have a good night.
Production support for InFocus is provided by Smithville, a locally owned business serving central and southern Indiana since 1922 with residential and business internet, voice, and security services. Smithville, local pride, global technology. Information at smithville.net. Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for central and southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com, and by viewers like you. Thank you.